Okay, so this is understanding the police movement, police abolition movement for non-abolitionists. My name is Scott Jones. I'm director of the Electronic Frontiers Forums, and also I'm the director of Electronic Frontiers Georgia. And Electronic Frontiers Georgia is a civil liberties and hacker defense organization. We were not a social justice organization, and we have a very it's the most politically diverse group I've ever been in. So we have social justice people. We also have conservatives, including Trump voters. And so, I end up, having to, kind of find the middle road and find what we agree on and maybe keep the peace a little bit. We really don't have a problem, but it does shift our perspective. It's why we don't generally focus on abortion, for one thing, except maybe the privacy issues around that. But I was part of a group, part of a coalition that was concerned about the shot spotter system, which is the gunshot detection system. And we joined a coalition that had a significant number of police abolition groups in it. And so I had to come up to speed pretty quickly on what police abolition is. Now, I'm also the victim of crime. I was, working from home alone by myself, and my house was hit by a robbing crew of four. And so I was home invaded. And they got my flat screen and they dropped it on the way out. But yeah, if they weren't expecting anybody to be at home. If they had guns drawn, they could have dropped me right then and there. So yeah, I've been a victim. And so when I heard about police abolition, it was kind of like, wow, what happens? You called 911 and nobody comes. So, it was a learning curve for me and kind of a learning process, and we'll go into that. But I'm going to go down go down the road here and get other people to introduce themselves, and please tell us your connection to police abolition.
Yeah, also just want to start off by saying I know it's early and this is the roughest day, so I appreciate you being here. And hopefully we can do a conversation a little bit for folks. But my name is Sarah Schultz. I use she, they pronouns. I work at Fight for the Future. We're a digital rights and tech justice organization that runs national campaigns against censorship and surveillance. My work is mostly around abortion surveillance, free expression, and how LGBTQ youth interact with the internet. I'm also an abolitionist by framework and by training as an organizer. And I think I'll offer a personal connection because I think that's actually super important here. My family is kind of the reason I'm an abolitionist, and not because anyone in my family is actually incarcerated or experienced police violence, but because my uncle, my mother's brother, was murdered in the 80s in very violent crime in Houston, Texas, where I'm from. And I think we need to talk about violence because that's at the heart of a lot of these issues. And one thing that I've learned through my experience as an abolitionist, having a personal family history where someone close to me, someone close to my mother was murdered, and those people were put in prison, and two of them were actually executed and on death row for several years, is that it didn't do much for my family that experienced this. There was no mental health resources for my grandparents, having lost a teenager in a violent crime. There was no support system outside of these people were incarcerated and killed by the state. That did nothing for my mother, it did nothing for my family. And so I think actually what it taught me as an abolitionist is that even when the system, quote unquote, works, it doesn't work in the way that actually supports survivors. So that's what kind of politicized me around violence, around police and prison abolition, is actually kind of being on the other side, I suppose, and being told justice is served, except it didn't really feel like that. And also just growing up in Texas at a border state in Houston with a city full of immigrants from an immigrant family. Just the ways that the immigration system was weaponized and criminalized people for existing, walking down the street all the time. I think it's hard not to be politicized around the cops. So that's my personal connection. We can get training up here.
So I'm Nash. I am, for identification purposes, I am the managing director of advocacy for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Interestingly, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation is not an abolitionist organization. I am an abolitionist, and so that also pertains. And so I can speak a little bit about what that means for my work and the way I approach my work in that space. I also am, Scott mentioned the ShotSpotter work. I'm also on the board of Lucy Parsons Labs, which is explicitly an abolitionist organization, and so there's ways I approach my organizing differently in that space than I do in my work at EFF. In my work at EFF, being that is not an abolitionist organization, but I also want to live in, my praxis. One of the things that I have to consider frequently is when I'm looking at work that may be reformist, is it creating reform that I will later have to dismantle if I want to see the world that I want to see? Or is it a step in that direction that is not creating more funding or more resources to organizations that I don't necessarily want to support? And interestingly, earlier this year, I had an incident where I have cameras. A lot of folks have different kinds of camera, ring camera, otherwise. I have cameras that are not ring cameras, that are not being shared with law enforcement outside of my apartment. I live in an apartment in San Francisco where I have a little outdoor space. And so I looked outside and I was like, oh, that's interesting. My patio furniture is gone. And I went back to my cameras and I saw that, and I could see. I didn't know the kids, but I'd seen them before, and I kind of knew where they hang out and whatnot. And so, not wanting to use the power of the state, I put up some signs, and I was like, "Hey, the last thing I want to do is have any kids that are living in our neighborhood." And these were two Black presenting, one Latino presenting kids. And I was like, the last thing I want to do is create opportunities for engagement with the state for y'all. So just put this stuff back so I don't have to file a police report to get my insurance, right? and so now, mind you, in that situation, even though I would not and I wouldn't have brought in the power of the state, it was the threat of state violence, right? That was the manipulating force there, right? And so what that speaks to is how, even as abolitionists, sometimes we have to realize that there's still a lot of work for us to do in building the system, right? In building the community empowerment resources that make this the potential or even the threat of state violence irrelevant, right? So thank you.
Good morning. My name is Cory Rosenberger. I am an assistant district attorney in the Conasauga Judicial Circuit. That is Whitfield and Murray County here in Georgia. It is right just south of Chattanooga. Obviously, I would identify as a non-abolitionist. Otherwise, I'd have to find a new job. But I thought this panel would kind of be interesting, and I would imagine I'll have somewhat contrary views just to some of my fellow panelists. I've been practicing law for a little over a decade now, exclusively criminal law. I do pride myself that I've worked both sides of that. I spent my first 3.5 years as an assistant public defender. For those of you that don't know what that is, that means I represented indigent people or people that can't afford an attorney when they are charged with crimes. I then switched sides and became an assistant district attorney where I actually prosecute crime. I've been doing that for about 7 years. As far as my personal views on the matter, I do believe, some police presence is always going to be necessary there. I certainly acknowledge that there are areas that are over-policed though. I'll throughout this, I anticipate kind of giving you a kind of a view into the mind of some of my clients when I was a public defender. Obviously, I can't give you any names or break attorney-client privilege, but it was very eye-opening talking to day in and day out, talking to people that have been charged with crimes. And I actually think that my time as an assistant public defender lends itself more to this talk than my time as an assistant DA, because I'm actually talking to those people charged with crimes, wondering, if there's a conviction here, is this going to change this person's, or is this going to stop this person from continuing to commit crimes, that kind of thing. A little bit about me.
Okay. So abolition is a movement. It's not an organization or a fixed set of standards. So this means that it's different things to different people. You can ask 20 people who know what they're talking about, what is the abolition movement? And you can get 20 great answers to that question, but they're all different. So instead of asking what the abolition movement is, I'm going to go down the line and ask, what does it mean to you?
Can I also just do a big, how many of you have heard the word abolition, engaged with it at all? Even in reading a post. Okay. how many of you and this is not a loaded question. I just like to get a read of the room. Would you consider yourself an abolitionist? Okay. Well, okay, just like to get a read because it could be either way. So what does it mean to you? Okay, abolition as a movement, as a framework for me, it's a framework, right? It's a kind of very similar to what Nash says. It's when I'm doing my work, how am I actually making sure these are not things that I'm going to have to peel back, or that these are not things that enhance the surveillance state, that give more money, more funding to cops, more funding to the military industrial complex, more money to keeping people in prison and policing people every day. Abolition as a framework and as a movement is about an acknowledgement that we have put money, time, actually more money than you can even wrap your mind around, putting people in cages, and not the same effort or the same investment in actually keeping people alive and keeping their lives well. I come out of abortion access organizing, and something we talk about all the time is that reproductive justice is about people living in a way where they have access to food, water, housing, community, healthcare, all of these things that a lot of us view as inherent rights. But we have put money, time, and the entire structure of the United States around policing and caging people. That's our money. We talk about in politics a lot, like a budget is your set of priorities. What the budget says is actually what your priorities are. And in the United States, our priority is bombs, cages, police and guns. Like, that is what our priorities are.
Oh, and surveillance too.
And surveillance, yes, in that. So for me, abolition is an acknowledgement and a way of actually organizing to say that we need to peel back, we need to dismantle these systems that keep people in cages and keep people policed, because it's not the way to make our lives better. We are sold a narrative about public safety, when public safety, and for abolitionists and for myself, is people having access to healthcare, people have access to books, people having good teachers, good classrooms, access to housing, food, water, all those things. And that is not a right in the United States. I think this also, I don't want to go too far into like the politics of it all, but I think that's also part of it, in terms of like America as a system being based in colonialism, in slavery, and that not being divorced from the systems that exist today. So also just the acknowledgement that we need to dismantle these systems because the United States was built on colonialism and slavery.
So I'm gonna pull from a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's an academic abolitionist, done a lot of amazing work. And she and when answered asked a similar question, her response was, abolition is not absence, it's presence, building life-affirming institutions, right? So again, it's like building things that are actually going to meet the needs of our community. You know, right? The Vera Institute did a study from 2019 to 2021 in 9 cities, including Baltimore, Burlington, Vermont, Cincinnati, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Hartford, Connecticut, New Orleans, Louisiana, New York, Seattle, and Tucson. And of 15.6 million community member initiated calls to 911, 62% of them across all 9 cities were for nonviolent incidents, right? For nonviolent things. There were only 3%, no more than 3% of 911 calls in any of those cities was around violent crime, right? But our 911 systems are built to have police officers who are, have a monopoly on violence, right? To respond to things that they're not being specifically trained for. Right. And that's responsive, right? That's reactive. What are the things that are creating these situations? What are the things that are creating the conditions that make us feel unsafe or uncomfortable in our communities? That is the thing that we need to do. And so when we talk about abolition, it's about how do we build the systems that make it not necessary for armed people who are not trained to be the only responders. A few years ago, I had a friend who was having a mental health crisis, and we wanted to have, and she was living in Oakland. And we wanted to get her assistance. And luckily, Oakland has changed the way that they operate. But she was a young Black woman, and the idea that at that time, if we called for help for her in a mental health crisis, that the people that were going to respond were going to be armed police officers, meant that we were very hesitant to actually be able to take the actions that were available to us to actually get her the care that she needed, right? And so instead of having all of those funds when less than 3% of the incidents that that 911 is being called for are for violent crimes when an armed person is maybe the right responder. doing things that actually prevent those conditions, like actually building better conditions for housing, including improving our mental health systems, making sure that youth have the services, care, and things that they need to be able to flourish and survive in our society, and providing more non-police safety solutions. Thank you.
Surprisingly enough, I think I probably agree with you on the matter of the balance. We probably won't agree on where that balance is, but I kind of do tend to agree that there need to be more options. I never gave this in my bio because I usually don't. It never comes up. But I was a part-time firefighter for 5 years, where I would work one shift on a week. I'd work my normal 9 to 5, and then on either Saturday or Sunday, if someone wanted off at the station, I'd go work for them. And we responded to calls all the time when the police weren't there. And there's certainly plenty of 911 calls that don't need a police response. Now, I couldn't in good faith say that there aren't plenty of 911 calls where the police are needed, in my opinion. It's all about that balance, I guess. I also worked for a little while with the mental health court. I was the assistant DA in my circuit, and I can kind of explain accountability courts a little bit. That's more, I guess, the criminal justice side than the law enforcement side. So that might not really be on topic with this panel. But yeah, definitely that balance of, if you have somebody that, is going through a crisis, thinking about committing suicide, and they call 911 instead of, a crisis number, you probably, unless they say they have a gun, you probably could send somebody who is not an armed police officer out there, and get a better result. And I'm certainly willing to acknowledge that.
So can anyone address the history with respect to the Attica Prison Riots in 1971, and where does the name abolition come from?
Well, I'm getting older, but I wasn't there. But I do know that the Attica Prison Riots, which is named after the Attica Prison in upstate New York, which takes its name from a Greek city, was prisoners. When notably the Attica Prison in their perspective was doing a lot of meaningful reforms, but it was still having the same the harms that are inherited to the prison industrial complex were still present, right? And so the prisoners there had an uprising, and they were calling for just those things. They were calling for better mental health services. They were calling for better housing. They were calling for better support systems, better things that would prepare them for life outside of once they were released, so we could reduce the likelihood of recidivism and what have you. And there was a very violent police reaction to our state reaction to that, which resulted in the death of 34 people, which was initially which they initially blamed the prisoners for, and then once there were investigations into it, seemed like almost all of the violence that happened that resulted in death was the police response, or the armed response to the prisoner uprising that was calling for better systems and for better care and better services for the people that were there, ostensibly to be really rehabilitated, but we know that that's not actually what happens in our prison system.
And I think also I'll mention is that I think it's like out of their demands, I don't know how many demands there were, like 25 of them were met. Which, I just wanted to bring that into the room, because I think in abolitionist movement spaces, when we talk about Attica, it's also important to understand that these people had concrete lists, they wrote out a policy of what they wanted to be met. I think oftentimes when it comes to, and we've seen this with Black Lives Matter uprisings, the uprisings of summer of 2020, that the narrative does not meet with what is happening on the ground. I think that we can all acknowledge that. But also on top of that, there is concrete policy demands. There is actually concrete demands and things that people are asking for. And often the narrative to say it was just a riot, it was just an outpouring of random violence is a mechanism of the state to argue that these people are meant to be in here. These people are meant to live in cages, because if they are outside of these cages, then they will bring this violence to your communities. When actually this was a result of these demands were not being met. They took matters in their own hands, right? So I think that we also just need to think about why people are messaging this way, why we actually taught to like think of this as a riot. Yeah.
Okay. So what is the difference between abolition and reform?
I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, again, I always come back to the money because I think it's easy for people to see and chart out. Critical Resistance is an organization that does abolitionist organizing and has a bunch of great graphics. If I at any point in time I pulled out their reformist reforms versus abolitionist organizing chart, because it literally will show you like what are the questions you should be asking to say, is this reform or is this like abolitionist steps to policing abolition? Because a lot of times it comes down to money. The example that I'll bring up often is body cameras, right? After 2016, after 2020, body cameras were definitely one of the things offered by a lot of governments. Like, oh, if you want accountability around police violence, we'll just put body cameras on everybody. What this actually resulted in is more funding for cops, right? Because the police department said, oh, well, if we want body cameras on somebody, we need more money, as if they don't have more money than God, and have tanks and explosives and surveillance structures that cost billions of dollars. They're like, if you want body cameras, we need more money. So this resulted in a lot of state legislatures and municipalities giving them more money to actually do these things that were reformist reforms. And what we see all the time is cops just turn the body cameras off, right? Or even if they're caught on camera doing police violence that is technically illegal, they are kept on the force, suspended, moved around. Like, it doesn't actually get these cops out of communities, right? Body cameras don't serve the function of actually getting cops off the streets, out of our communities, and not doing that violence against community members. So I bring up that example because I think it's a concrete one, right? Where it's like a lot of well-meaning people were like, body cameras might be one of the solutions, and in actuality, it actually expands the scope of policing and of surveillance. And it doesn't actually do anything to hold cops accountable. And this is like an hour and we could talk about just this step for like 3 hours, or I personally could. So I do recommend Critical Resistance because I think they do a really good job of laying out like what is reform, what is abolition, and why we should take the abolitionist steps.
Just to echo that, like anything that I say that sounds valuable, it's because I learned it from Critical Resistance and other folks that have been doing this organizing for a long time. Anything that doesn't sound valuable, that was mine. And I would say like around body cameras too, one of my concerns around body cameras is that they're facing in the wrong direction, right? They're not filming the officer, they're filming the community, right? So you're adding to the surveillance state that is often over executed in communities that already have the least housing resources, the other things that would actually create a better environment. And not to mention that, so like a little bit of an aside, the body cameras are almost like the percentage of which they are available to the officers to help them to modify and adjust their own statements of what they believe happened so that it accords with what the camera is going to show to the courts is far more likely to happen than accountability where the community actually gets access to see the video and be able to see whether or not what's being told to them coincides with what's actually been captured, right? So that's one of my, in addition to the additional funding and that it being a thing that we later have to dismantle, is one of my concerns with body cameras. But really, like that's where I remember when I was like first building my awareness, my analysis on abolition. One of the questions like what is radical change and what is reform, right? And Critical Resistance has a really, I think, important and I kind of spoke to it a little bit earlier, way that they look at it, like it's a false dichotomy, right? Because we need to be doing harm reduction in our communities, right? And so there are things that, in short of just abolishing the prison industrial complex, abolishing the police departments, there are things that we need to do right now, because we can't simply say, I liken it to if we say like, I don't believe in HMOs, right? So I'm not calling for an ambulance when you get sick. Like, no, that is, I may not believe in this thing, but I do want to make sure I'm stopping the bleeding, right? And so what are the things that we can do to make sure that we're reducing the bleeding, we're reducing the harms in our community? They may be reformist, but as long as they are not creating more funding for institutions we don't believe in, as long as they're not creating more complications to leading toward a world where communities have the things that they need to thrive and they have ways to support themselves that are transformative, that create better environments, then the harm reduction is critical, right? And so it is kind of like a false dichotomy between like the reform and the radical change. It's like, is the reform that's happening reducing harm while moving toward a better existence in the future.
And one thing I just wanted to say also is that when critical resistance talks about this, the 4 questions they ask is, does it reduce funding to police? Does it challenge the notion that police increase safety? I actually think this is a really important part of it. 3, reduce tools, tactics, technology police have at their disposal, or 4, reduce the scale of policing, right? So like those are the tenets of like when you can kind of chart the difference between a reformist reform or an abolitionist step. And the part about challenging the notion that police increase safety, I think about that a lot because I think that's kind of often the missing piece, right? Like we're actually, as abolitionists, really trying to challenge the idea that more police, more funding for the military and cops are actually public safety. Like that is like an underlying thing that most people, their first step into abolition really have to kind of like destabilize in your mind. We talk about feeling the cop in your head all the time. And I think this is like a big step of it, right? Like what and when you and I think we bring up personal examples because I want you to think about the person in your life that has had police interactions or police interference, and a lot of times it's mental health, it's poverty, it's crises that are not violent by actual nature towards other people, but violence towards yourself or violence that the state has actually brought upon you. And so we need to challenge the idea that just doing these things, like the idea that the cops are necessary for a lot of these interactions are the things you have to destabilize along with the actual funding.
So I'd say abolitionists or abolitionism, I guess, is more, I guess, the word itself means to just formally end something, and so I think reframing it. I don't know. Do y'all? I'm kind of taking over Scott's job here. Do y'all believe that in this movement that there should not be any police or just a reduced police presence?
I would argue something that we wouldn't recognize as a police as a police
Okay.
state as it exists today, right? So they're similar. You mentioned that you're a fireman. When we have fire departments, right? We have fire stations around our communities. When there's a fire, we call them, and they are very good at responding very quickly and handling the situation. We don't ask them to go out and rate their performance based off of how many fires they're able to find, right? If your performance is based on how many fires you're able to find, and there are no fires, then how is your job scaled, right? How is your job rated? How is your efficacy rated? We have them appropriately available to respond to incidents that meet the things that they are specifically trained to respond to, right? And as we said before, less than 3% of incidents that people call in for 911 are the types of things that you may need a trained, armed, protective response to, right? So I believe that building the things that reduce the likelihood would actually bring that number down even further. And then we do want to make sure that we have ways for people to get the response that they need when they are in violent situations, right? But there may be also things like de-escalation that police forces are not properly trained in that don't require violence as the response. And so I do think that what we currently vision as a police force, I don't think that in the world that I would want to see, it would look
Radically different.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's really it. It's like I tell people all the time, like we have a very limited imagination of how society because we're in the United States, right? And so we talk a lot about things that we don't have, like constantly, right? And because that lack of something, as Ruth Wilson Gomez talks about, the lack of something, like that is the violence, right? We want a presence of something else. And I think about like some of the like I'm sorry if I'm bugging the numbers. I did this again early on the last day. Most cops, I think, do 1 felony arrest a month. Like, I think that's the number. And so a lot of people, because of the, proliferation of true crime, shows about cops, like, constantly arresting serial killers or whatever, like, a lot of people imagine that cops are out there, like, doing intense detective work on really violent crimes all the time. The fact of the matter is that, like, and I get the what about rapists question a lot, right? And it's a fact in the United States that most rapists are not in prison. Most people who experience sexual violence never go to the cops because of the threats of actually reporting someone for sexual violence. So in actuality, right now, there are not a lot of sexual assault, people who have committed sexual assault in prison, but actually people experiencing sexual assault in the prison, right? So like that's something we talk about a lot. as people who actually deeply care about sexual violence, cops are not the answer to that, right? But we have to imagine a world where like that's not our limited imagination. Like in actuality, cops are doing traffic tickets, finding ways to like get their numbers up, right? They're not doing the intense detective work on violent crime that we imagine them to be. That's kind of like a fantasy of Hollywood that they're doing that. And so one of the things that I talk about a lot is that the kind of like everyday tasks of cops don't have to be done by cops, but cops have the most funding and the most resources. So we've outsourced, the government has passed the buck and said, well, we have this, this force of people that are not doing much, we'll also have them do all these other things, right? And so I think if we have a system that actually like funds these other things well, one, if we have people not living in poverty and also not experiencing mental health crises that could be solved and helped by having healthcare, then we can actually find ways for this to not be cop response, but actually highly trained people to actually do the thing that we need them to do.
Anecdotally, it's funny. I guess several years ago, at this point, there was a rift between Bill De Blasio, who was the mayor of New York City at the time, and the NYPD, right? And so for a number of weeks, the NYPD went on kind of like they're not legally allowed to strike, but they were like, actually what they said was, we're only gonna arrest the people we have to. Which, like, what were you doing before?
Yeah.
And during that period, even reported crime dropped dramatically, right? And so they had always had this like thing like, well, if we're not here, what's gonna happen? And actually they stepped back and it was okay. We were fine.
Most people don't.
Okay. I have to admit, yeah, we do have some conservative members in my organization, and I was talking to one of them about some of the abolition topics, and they're like, "Oh no, that's defund the police," and I got that kind of reaction to it. Abolition and defund the police, they're unique and distinct, but they do have connections. So I wanted to ask, what's the relationship between the abolition movement and defund the police movement? One is obviously much older, and I would argue probably more mature than the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it, and I think I've harped on about money over and over again. I'm so sorry. That's my thing. When I was like training as an abolitionist organizer, and this was before defund the police was kind of like it was a slogan for us, but like not really like in the mainstream as it was after summer 2020. Defund the police was a strategy, right? Like it was like, and defund the police had existed as a model for organizing in abolitionist communities for a long time. Like I was going to college in Austin, and the organization in Austin is Community of Colors United, and they had been pushing for basically a defund the police model, right? Every time a police contract came up, they were at city council saying, don't put this money into the police department, put it into mental health resources, put it into healthcare, put it into services for unhoused people. Like that's actually how we protect people in this community, not the cops. So that's like something that's happened over and over and over again. Abolitionist organizers have used this model. And I think what has happened because of the political situation after 2020 is kind of a warping of defund the police itself, and it's kind of separating it from the aims, right? Which is not to say that we just take the money from the police and that's the end of it, right? The whole idea of the framework of it is a strategy of abolitionists to say, this is one of the steps we can take in the system that exists now. I think one of the criticisms we often get is like, how could you ever believe that we'll ever abolish the police? And it's like, well, you're in your communities right now. The first step you can take is this kind of model. This is a type of organizing. This is an organizing framework you can use to actually affect change in your community in the meantime, right? It is the step to actually scaling back the scale of police abolition. So the way, the way I think about it is it's a step. It was part of the framework that I was taught, and I think that again, going back to the ways that we're taught about prison riots, right? In abolitionist spaces, we would call that a rebellion. Boxers would call it a riot, right? I think you do have to think about like when slogans are warped, going back to like where did this actually originate? What was the purpose? And it's always been like, let's put more money for teachers, cops, libraries, funding for mental health resources, etc. Let's not give it to the cops. So that's the way I think about it, at least.
A lot of my job is messaging, right? Like how can we tell like a really complicated story in a way that's accessible to folks? How can you meet folks where they're at? And I think that is part of the intention around the defund the police movement as such is we look at a lot of communities where police are viewed as an occupying force within that community, right? They have, whether it's Form 1033 program and the federal government giving them, equipment that was formerly used to occupy other areas around the world, and now it's being used within our communities domestically, or whether it's just simply like, just flooding the area with officers who don't live in that community or not familiar with that community, view that community as the opposition rather than themselves as public servants. So like that is an area that a lot of people can see, even if they're not to the point where they're like, oh, actually, like they're not visualizing the solution, but they are like, what is happening in my community, right? And so it's the first step that is able for folks to understand, especially when they've seen violence as a result of it, right? And then, but the important part, and what Sarah's speaking to, is like defund the police is only part of the picture. It's like then it's not like now then we defund the police and like reassign the money to, a million ways I could see it be bad ideas, right? But defund the police and reallocate the money to things that actually build safer, healthier communities. So like that's the other piece. But that is not a great headline, right? That is not a great campaign slogan, right? So defund the police is like, okay, like now I want to know more, right? And then you have the ability to tell the story further. But that is the first step in being able to say, look around you, hear things that you can see and you can visualize as problems, and then we can get into the larger, more complicated ways that how do we create how do we reduce the necessity to see those as even a solution.
So to kind of play devil's advocate here for a second, to the notion of defunding the police. I think it would actually be safer to abolish the police in some aspects than it would be to defund them. I'll give you some personal experience with my work. Generally, just with all groups of people, there is a small minority that gives the rest of the group a very bad name. I've seen it firsthand with the police, if anything, I think we should maybe take a second look at the gear, like the tanks, the riot equipment. That might not belong in a police department, but actually paying the officers. The less you pay your officers, the less quality of officer you're going to get. And I've seen some there's kind of two kind of archetypes of police officers that I deal with. Most of them genuinely want to change their community for the better. But some of them have this notion, and these are the bad ones, that I want this job because I want power. I would be lying to you if I say that they don't exist out there. And me as an assistant district attorney is telling you that. And if we start taking money away from them, if we're taking it away from their salaries or away from making it a less favorable or a lesser job, you're going to lose a lot of those quality people, and you're going to get a lot more of the I want this power and I want it easily. And so that I think that there's a real danger there. Obviously, I'm probably a little more on the other side than my co-panelists, but I'll leave it at that.
But did you catch that we've brought him to abolition?
I mean, I've heard this live, talking to people. I've heard, I think that this is a common criticism here, and I mean, just to say it, like I think that's true across the board, and that's like a thing that for the police union, and the police union is one of the strongest political forces in the country, and I say that about teachers, right? Like the less we fund teachers, like
exactly.
But like the problem inherently with the police, right, is that money is so. Again, like I bring up the tanks and I bring up the surveillance structures and I bring up like these people are unlimited funding. Like it is like they're bleeding money, and so I think that one of the things when we talk about the differences between like the cops that want to do good, right, and I'm not really on that team. I can't even say it. I'm so sorry. But I do think some of this, like as someone who cares about labor, like some of this is like that we don't have there's nowhere for those people to go if they exist because we don't have like they don't have another place to go. I would actually rather us fund the education system so much that those people who want to do good have another place to go besides being cops. I mean, I'm from Texas, right? We have so many prison towns in Texas, right? Like I have so many friends who grew up in prison towns where all of their families, all of their cousins, all of their parents all work for the prison in this town, right? And I do often get this question of like, where is my family supposed to work if this prison doesn't exist, right? We get that question all the time. And again, this is about priorities, right? I'm not imagining that we tear that prison down and there is nothing left in this town. I'm imagining that all the funding that goes to that prison is put into things where we can actually employ people, we can actually have education systems, park systems, like a whole plethora of things that are not the top prisons, right? So I think that when we're talking about the labor aspect of it, like the lack of choice is not to say that we should keep funding the same. Yes.
It's actually to speak to a little bit to that point. There's a greater organization most folks may not know them. Like there's New York City in the bottom of the state, right? And then you have a whole other rest of the state, which is largely agricultural, right? But agricultural and prisons, right? And so they ship all of the bodies from New York City into the rural areas of the state, and that's where a lot of their economy is based on. And so there is a brilliant organization called Milk Not Jails, right? Which is like all of their work is right. How do we rebuild the agricultural communities? How do we rebuild the agricultural economy so that those rural communities in upstate New York are not dependent upon the prison industrial complex as their primary source of living, right? We don't want those folks to be unemployed and as we deal with other societal ills.
Okay. Yeah, looking at the amount of time we have left, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Can we talk quickly about restorative justice, transformative justice, and some of the alternatives to incarceration?
So, can I start with this one? So, I'm actually excited about this one. There's at least in Georgia, we're starting to see a very, very slow shift from incarceration. Before I get into this, there are two general ideas that the criminal justice system uses to try to stop people from committing more crimes: punishment and rehabilitation. The idea with punishment is that you punish them and they're like, wow, that was horrible, I don't want to do that again. And then there is rehabilitation, which is, oh, I see why, beating my wife is bad, I'm going to quit doing that. And so we're actually starting to see a shift a little bit. Again, it's not moving quickly as anything in government does, but it's moving from punitive punishments, prison, to more of the, we call them accountability courts. And so we have, in my circuit, which is, again, a very small area, Dalton, Georgia, we have a domestic violence court, we have a mental health court, and a drug court. You are still on probation, you still are convicted, but a lot of these programs, they go to classes, they're tested drug tested regularly, they come to court, and we're starting to see a shift. A lot of my coworkers really don't like it. I kind of pride myself on have worked both sides, the criminal defense side and the prosecution side. But you see a much lower, an astronomically lower recidivism rate. Recidivism is people committing crimes after you've committed that crime before. But you see a much lower recidivism rate with the rehabilitation programs as opposed to sending people. There are people that spend more time in prison that they get more used to that environment, and it just blows my mind that they're just in and out of prison, and they're in prison more in their life, but not for long, not like a 20-year stint. They'll go for 3 years. They'll get out on parole for 6 months, and then get shipped back to prison. And it's just for a lot of times for these nonviolent offenses. And that's where the accountability courts really, you give them a shot at, how about, we don't, you can make money by getting a job instead of from, taking it from other people. So we're going to, help you with a job, help you with this. And it's really, and it's interesting. There's a lot of science behind it as well. I don't know the sciencey part, but I always talk to the therapists and the social workers about it in court.
I mean,
go
go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to also just speak on that for a second, where and bring in my personal example. The man who killed my uncle, okay, and I'm sorry again, like trigger warning for violence, but also I do think we need to really like face this head on. The man who killed my uncle had previously been in prison, right? He had served, I think, a 5-year stint, if I'm remembering correctly, for something else. I think it was a robbery or something that wasn't as violent. The man who killed my uncle, so he had already been in prison, right? And one of the reasons why, when after he killed him, and also the other people involved, there was a total of 4 people killed. One of the things that he talked about was he had previously worked at the place that my uncle had worked at and was fired. And this had created such a massive crisis for him because he had already been previously incarcerated and it was hard for him to find a job, right? And so that's one of the things I think about a lot, right? Is that my uncle was killed for about $2,000. Like if we're just to get that down to like the monetary aspect of it, which is like really hard to think about. But it's also like, I do want to think about the entire context, right? Like this man was deeply, deeply traumatized from his stint in prison, got out and realized that his options were so limited. Like there was no rehab, there was nothing to do. He got one job and was fired from that job. And that was going to create such a like colossal, just horrific situation in his life where he was not going to be able to survive it. You know, and I don't want to like excuse the violence of it all, but I have had to think about this, right? Like if he hadn't been fired, if he had been able to get a better job, if that wasn't going to be spell like the really like the end of his life in a different way, what would that have changed for my uncle, right? And I think about that, I have to think about that, right? Because the narrative from, I guess, the other side is that that man should have never been let out of prison in the first place because he committed violence. I don't agree with that, right? I think that he shouldn't have been in prison, but he should have had other options. Like that's what I have to think about, and that's what I've been brought to. So I just wanted to offer that there. And then in terms of the transformative justice aspect of it, the thing that I'll say to start off is that many communities in the United States have practiced transformative and restorative justice without presence of cops for a very long time, right? Black communities, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities that can't trust the cops to actually adjudicate justice for them have had responses that were not carceral to things in their community since the beginning of humans existing, right? Cops have not always existed for one, but also in the present time, there are communities that cannot depend on the cops. One of the examples that we bring up a lot is a woman is in a domestic violence situation, an interpersonal violence situation, maybe from her partner, maybe from her father, etc., and calls the cops. More often than not, the person who calls the cops, or especially if they're in a Black community, if they're in an immigrant community, is criminalized through that aspect, right? Whether or not it's a police violence incident, or it's that they don't have income after this person goes to prison or is in jail and therefore they lose their kids because CPS is like, you can't support yourself now. Whether or not they themselves have taken part in violence as a result of like trying to defend themselves. There's so many instances, so many of these transformative justice organizers are specifically politicized around women themselves being criminalized over trying to get cops to actually deal with their abusers, right? That is a struggle in many communities. Specifically, as a personal example, I belong to a South Asian community that is mostly immigrants. And at one point in time in the United States, most South Asian organizations that were nonprofits were actually domestic violence organizations because immigrants in that community were so dependent on one financial stream of income that most women could not leave those situations, or they would be either deported or not have access to their children anymore. And so the one in Austin actually started because it was just like a group of uncles that like you could call and they would go to your house and be like, stop hitting your wife. Like, I mean, like that's literally what it was, because their wives would not call the cops because they're like, I'm going to be deported, or my kids are going to get taken. I can't go through with the divorce because I'm on an H-1B visa. So if my husband goes to prison, then we are all deported, right? So like, these are like actually vectors of people already doing this. So I don't want to say like, we're having to come at this from a whole new like experience. There are many communities that have been doing this for a very long time. And I can't completely explain transformative justice in 5 minutes. So I'm going to offer some resources at the end. But the big thing is that it's a political framework, an approach to responding to justice without involving the police, and then restorative justice being slightly different as like an actual accountability framework of practice that I have been trained on, and that you can do like training on how in your communities, how restorative justice practices can be used. So if someone actually commits some sort of violence, or if, someone experiences harm at the hands of another, what are the actual like alternatives to involving the police? How can we actually deal with this inside of our communities? One, in ways that communities that can't trust the police have been doing for a very long time, but also new ways like to actually respond.
So yeah, you bring up a good point that like those systems, those community response systems, actually policing as we recognize it is only 200 years old. Like those actually like predate policing and have been around for like much longer of our existence than what we recognize as policing today. And I have my family, just being because of poverty, because of racism. So I grew up in Brooklyn, but I grew up with I hung out with like folks that like came from money. That were like a lot of white kids, and also like my own family, like black folks, brown folks, and it was funny because anecdotally, like I go to like Park Slope, nice neighborhood, and kids there would just like kind of like sit out on their stoop, smoke weed, and even before decriminalization, never had a problem with it, right? Young black kids have something in their pocket, maybe because they need to protect themselves or otherwise, they're getting stopped and frisked. 90% black and brown folks, right? And less than 1% white folks. And so as a result of that, they're becoming engaged in the criminal system, right? And so we already spoke to the fact that once you get out of the criminal system, the likelihood of your being able to get a job is extremely more difficult, right? And that's even in places like New York, where they've already done like ban the box, right? Where you can't ask someone about their criminal history when they're applying for employment. But even if you're able in a place like New York where you have like somewhat better opportunity to get a job, when you have kids that have been institutionalized since they were youth, right? And they've been involved in the criminal system since they were youth. They've been in systems where that told them, okay, this is what time you eat, this is where you go. You don't have to manage your own money, you don't have to do any of those things. For a lot, I know people personally that they actually feel more comfortable there, right? Like because they've been so institutionalized, it's been so much a part of like what has been forced upon them as their life, that living outside and having to make the decisions that we make every day is actually more intimidating to them. So I have instances where I'm like, that person did that thing because they needed to go back, right? Like because that's how institutionalized they are. So these systems are not really serving what we want them to, which brings us to the question of restorative justice. How do we actually create systems that are creating better opportunities and addressing the needs of the victim, right? Locking someone up doesn't necessarily like put the victim into a better place, right? And so restorative justice principles do look at like what are the things that we can do to address what happened to this person and why it was caused and what happened. Transformative justice systems, on the other hand, are actually like more community centered, right? So you're looking within the community. What was the incident that happened? What happened? What happened to this person as a result of it? And how do we make sure that that person is able to continue to thrive and not live in fear or what have you? That might be the results. But also looking at like, why did you do this thing, right? What were the conditions that created the need that you felt like this was the thing that you had to do, and addressing like what are the things as communities that we can do that actually identify how do we help the survivor of the thing, the person who's been impacted by it, how do we put them into a position where they feel whole, and then also realize that this didn't happen in a vacuum, right? There were conditions that contributed to that precipitating this thing, and how do we as a community respond to making sure that we are looking at it more holistically and transforming ourselves and the environment in order to respond to it.
Okay, I'm gonna let this run over so we can do a little bit of Q&A, but we do need to finish up last couple of questions. I want to ask, what are some of the valid criticisms of the movement? And from my point of view, as an outsider who's lifting back the tent, I see a lot of inside baseball. I see a lot of the organizations that do this. I feel like a lot of them are keeping to themselves and only letting the kind of the insiders in. They don't really want to do outreach, or they don't do it as much as I think they should do it. And that's just kind of my perspective. And I think one of the things I'd like to do is to try to bring this to the wider audience. I feel like I'm not trying to drag anybody to the left politically. I'm trying to drag these issues to the center and realize that no matter where you are in the political spectrum, if you're a victim of crime, it doesn't matter whether you're left, center, or right. These affect all of us, and that's kind of what I'd like to see. I would like to see more outreach. Do you have any other criticisms of where we are today?
I mean, and I think that some of this is criticism, some of this is just like context on like where we're at as a country and as movements and so many things. But I strive in my work as an abolitionist, as an organizer, to be as down to earth and not academic as possible. And I think some of this, like, we need the political theory, like we need the like complicated, I need the data, like I need the big books, like I need a lot of it. But just as like a person who does political education. I just try to not be that because I don't think, I think most people like, we want to meet people where they're at, right? So like, I think that's one thing I'll say is I want to meet people where they're at. I want to connect this to people's lived experiences rather than it being like this big thing that seems one, unwinnable, or two, too big to really like wrap your minds around. So I want people to think about more like, how does policing intersect with your personal experience in your life? And then what are the actual vectors that would change that? And so I don't know if it's so much a criticism as like, I think we can always do better. And like, and I think also like abolition as a movement is not like owned by, a few organizations, but also like as practitioners and as organizers, like we have to kind of bring it to many kinds of movements. Like we don't want to be like insular. Like I think that one of the things like me and Nash work around like tech and surveillance, obviously those are very connected, but when I'm in abortion spaces, I often am like the only person who's like, and prisons and police are the problem, or like, and when I'm in my immigrant spaces, like there's a lot of different movement spaces that I think we could bring this to and like make it very central to kind of what you're saying, like the movement work that a lot of people are doing. So I think that's something.
I think anti-repression work, right? I think that the reason a lot of those spaces are insular is because of fear of what are the repercussions for organizing in ways that challenge the powers that exist right now, right? And so how do we make sure that we are actually like living what we believe is our morals and being able to share ideas that may not be popular ideas and explore different thoughts without the idea that the powers of the state will exert their violence against us for simply exploring ideas and being able to look for new solutions. And that is like one of the things that I frequently think of. It is an important question. Like if someone is subject to domestic violence, for instance, right? Like if I haven't provided the alternatives for them to be able to get safety that they need, I can't fault them for calling the police if that's the only solution that's available to them, right? And so one of the things that I think as an abolitionist that we have to do is like that is our failure to provide the system, to build the systems that support people in the ways that we need. So one of the things that I want to do is both like, and the anti-repression piece is required for it, to be able to like make sure that within my community we're continuously building alternatives. As I can't say I want to abolish the state if there's a percentage of my community that is getting their food as a result of that. So if I'm not building the systems that make the current systems irrelevant, right? If I'm not building the new and the shell of the old, then I can't fault you for calling on the only resources that you see as being available to you.
So I'm going to give you a couple of extremes from my job. The first is kind of the idea of being over-policed a little bit. I had a case once. I read the incident report. A woman fished a candy bar out of a vending machine. I looked at it and I said, there's no way any jury on this planet is going to care about this, nor would this improve our society by convicting her of this, and I dismissed the case. The officer came by and confronted me saying, there's no evidence, there's not an evidentiary reason. Why did you dismiss this case? And I kind of explained it to him, like, listen, I have a limited amount of resources. This is not a good arrest. Technically, she's guilty of misdemeanor theft, but you need to be doing something else with your time, man. On the other hand, when I can probably count on two hands now the number of just truly evil people that I have met in my line of profession that I believe. Now, again, like I said earlier, a small group of any population of people gives the rest of that population a bad name, and criminal defendants are the same way, I think. Most crimes are gross overreactions to a perceived wrong or just like a crime of opportunity. There are very few actual sociopaths that need to be locked up forever, but I would be lying to myself if I said that group doesn't exist. And so there is that balance, in my opinion. I'm not a huge fan of the term abolitionist. I think that the movement of reducing this idea of being over policed may get more traction if they call it criminal justice reform. I understand the strategy though of not wanting to compromise and then meeting your opponent somewhere in the middle.
I will just say on the name though, like it's calling upon like slavery abolition. So like, and so in terms of like just the
Okay.
term itself, yeah, I think like I just want to clarify also just to say it like the prison abolitionists correctly and like call upon like slavery abolition because it at the time of people organizing for slavery abolition, abolition of slavery, there were a lot of folks like, what if we just reform it? Like, what if we just scale it back? Like, what if there's more like rights, like whatever, which also obviously we know is bullshit, but that's basically like what it calls upon, right? The idea that we have to dismantle this, that it is inherently colonialism, slavery, is the actual issue at hand. We have to dismantle it. So I just want to say that in terms of the term, like, and again.
And similarly, at that time, they're like, how will our economy survive if we don't do this thing, right? We have this idea that like these institutions that didn't exist forever, but now we can only see the world with them, right? So similarly, like that is it called upon that because it's another good example of a system that was horrible, but also was not necessary, and we were able to survive without it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not talking about slavery reform today.
It's just that's the idea behind it.
Okay, if you have questions, please line up at the microphone and we want to make sure that it is on. Before we get there, could you give us your best book or resource on the topic? And also, how do you find people, like-minded people who are also interested in abolition near you?
I'm gonna cheat because I'm not gonna give you one. I'm gonna give you a list, and the way I'm gonna cheat is, unfortunately, and I'm so sorry, plug my own website because I did do a syllabus. Sarah with an H, E, Phillips with one L, Philips. I have a tab under work, and under there's a syllabus. I really want to say that like there's a book you can read. I do think we should do a little bit more than that. Like I think for me it took a while. Like I needed to deeply understand like violence and really read about this. I try to put on that syllabus not just books also, but like videos, podcasts, like other types of media to make it a little easier and like getting into things. And there's a couple of like free audiobooks of Angela Davis's work, which I think is really important. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, already mentioned, is like the person who made me an abolitionist. There's a lecture from her, a couple lectures from her on there. And Mariam Kaba, Mariame, Kaba, Kaba, is also definitely on the list of people who made me abolitionists, and there's tons of researches from her on that syllabus.
Unsurprisingly, we have a lot of the same. So Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag. Mariam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us. Also Mariam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie's No More Police. Derricka Purnell's Becoming Abolitionist. Alex Vitale's The End of Policing. And also, yeah, and absolutely, and as far as like, if they're to just get great resources, and if you live in one of the few communities that actually have a chapter of critical resistance, is definitely like doing some of the most amazing work around prison abolition.
Also, shout out Detention Watch Network. They're doing more immigrant-based stuff, but doing the actual work on the ground of like protecting people from police. And there's often a lot of, they in their network have a lot of organizations in local communities.
Question: did you get your stuff back?
What stuff?
Your furniture.
Oh, my! I did get
oh my
back.
gosh.
Oh, yeah. And I
Told us about the flyer, but then didn't tell us you got your stuff back.
I know.
We're waiting an hour.
I don't know why this is though. Like, so there's 2 dudes and 1 woman that took the stuff. Like, they were all youth, right? But only all of the things came back, but it was just a woman that brought everything
Of
back.
course.
And that was like, that's messed up. But I did get everything back.
But on a serious note, so I'm curious. So like when Black Lives Matter happened, I started thinking about it, and I kept hearing about defund the police. I'm like, we don't need to defund them. We need to take some of the money from all of the heavy armor and do more training. And to the point of we need to do some site testing to find those power monger types. I was in the military, police, and the army, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know exactly what they should not be doing this job. But I started thinking, what am I supposed to do as a citizen? I can write my congressman, but that only works at a certain level. Then I started thinking about, in Gwinnett County, we have like the sheriff, policing community values. And I thought, who are you to be determining what our community values are? And then I started digging deeper, because I'm in this electronic frontier thing for 10 years. Then I'm like, what are we supposed to do? So I figured out we can write to those boards, those community boards. Do you guys promote that? Because I didn't hear about that as a thing of what we in the community can do.
So I'll take a couple of pieces of that. So I often So a few years ago, I was speaking to this police officer who who was dating a friend of mine that I grew up with, and he was in a position where he's like, "Hey, I can actually create new training systems for the NYPD. What are the things that we need to train them to do?" And my response to him was, "Well, the problem is you can take them to a 2 or 3 week training, but then they're going back to their precinct. They're going back into the policing institutions that are only going to reinforce for the next several years the things that are the ills within that system. So simply adding new training is not going to solve the problem of an institution that is flawed, right? When they say, for me, it's not a matter, I don't think that the system needs to be broken because it's already fixed, right? And so for me, that is not the solution. I do think, what can you do as a community member? I'll give you an example. In Brooklyn, there was an incident where in my community, I was living in Sunset Park, and there were a number of women that were being attacked, right? And so what community members did was they put out flyers and they created a number where anyone could have like you're on your way home, and most of this was happening on their walk from the train to their home. And so reach out to us. We will meet you at the train station and we will walk with you. Like 5 of us will come with you and walk with you so you get home. So we don't have to depend on the police department, right? We as community members will provide the safety that we need in our community. Right. And so, but should we at the same time, again, if there are things that you can do to reduce the harm of policing in your community, working with your city council members, working with your board of supervisors, and they are not going to create more funding for the police, they're not going to create more resources for the police, they are going to reduce the harm that's going to happen. Yes. Malcolm X famously said, by any means necessary. I modified that a little bit, by all means necessary, right? Let's do all of the things that we need to do to be able to create better and safer communities for ourselves.
And again, I'm gonna plug this graphic. I'm just gonna show you. Okay, it's linked on this thing. It literally has like several options of like things that are in the green area of things that like municipalities can take up. And so like there are specific concrete examples that we can be pushing these boards on, like be pushing city council on. I recommend also looking to see when your police contracts are up in your community, how much money is being pushed around. What these things like are kind of behind closed doors, but also like there's ways to. I plug that list all the time because there is things to do. And also just to your point, like we need to build the alternative. So like one of the things as an abolitionist that I'm really invested in is like mutual aid networks, because I do think that so much of this is caused by people not having access to 1, mental health resources, and then 2, like food. Like literally, like I think Food Not Bombs as an organization is doing more work than like a lot of policing organizations in so many ways, because they're literally just feeding people. And like there's Food Not Bombs organizations and chapters in cities across the country. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, we need to keep it moving.
Sorry.
So, quick.
Sure. My question to you all is, I mean, I don't really have any disagreement on anything you've said about how effectively we need to basically abolish the police. My issue, I've had some disagreements there, but I think that I think the framework and the naming of it is so ineffective that it scares people away. Like defund the police sounds scary, abolish the police sounds scary. It sounds like, okay, well now what I'm going to do when somebody comes to harm me. Is there not a benefit to maybe reframing it to even like abolish the police state? Is there not something to be said maybe around just creating fear in the opposite direction?
I'll say there's, in your community, you know what's going to be effective, right? I work back to my work at EFF. A lot of this has been like my personal capacity or my work with Legal Lucy Parsons Lab or Legal Activists Collective. But in my work at EFF, we frequently work with local communities to pass local legislation, right? And so like in EFF may have a potential, we have a way that we frame it, but we're going to defer to the people that live in that community for like, what are the things that are possible within your community? What's the messaging that's most effectively going to meet the needs of your community? So if you know within the place that you live, like you know what the principles are, but you know, in order to meet the people in my community where they're at, this is the way that I have to create that opportunity for entry, go for it.
And just an example, like in Austin, when we were doing defund the police work, before 2020, we were calling it Fund Communities, Not Cops. Like that's what it was called in Austin, right? And so I think also just to talk about the messaging of it all, like it's up to communities. Like, we have to like do that work ourselves, and a lot of communities are. It's just not the narrative, right? So I think that there's also just like a context issue too. Yeah, thanks very much.
Just real quick, as some of you may be aware, I work in downtown DC, which has now become completely militarized. And we've got 6 states worth of National Guardsmen in there. Some of them are picking the crap, some of them are armed. Has crime gone down? Absolutely. As soon as they are all gone, will crime go back up because they are not addressing the underlying issues in DC? Absolutely. So it's an experiment that you may just, you may want to keep an eye on until the Washington Post stops publishing their petition like your AJC did. So, great.
Yeah, I mean, and also the crime rates in DC were already going down
Right.
before the
Yeah. Right.
national agencies were brought in.
Right.
But you bring up a good point that, there's a friend of mine who used to work for Race Forward, which formerly Color of Change. No, not Color of Change. Race Forward, Nayantara Sen. One of the things that she kind of like gave me the great opportunity to like visualize is like a tree, right? And so you have the tree where it's like failures in schools, right? You have like the over policing, all these things, and these are fruits on that tree, right? And then if you don't address like xenophobia and racism, misogyny, all of the things that feed that tree, you can pull up those fruits, but a new fruit is just going to grow, right? And so the things that we're doing as far as over policing our communities, right, and putting federal agencies, federal officers into our communities are not addressing the core things, and so therefore, yeah, the new fruit is going to go back because you're not addressing what are the underlying issues that created the situation.
It looks good for a headline
Yeah.
for a few weeks.
It's political theater. Yeah.
Let's keep moving.
You mentioned that we need to look at solutions, and you mentioned a couple, to fix poverty and mental health to make police unnecessary. But if not by the inherently flawed state, could you please outline on a more detailed level on what steps would be taken and by who to create a previously unexisting, crimeless, almost utopian society where law enforcement is no longer necessary or beneficial? Additionally, how do we ensure that these changes occur on a national level without the involvement of the state?
Okay, and this is where I think I lose a lot of people, right? Because I'm going to start talking about like imagination and creativity and like stuff that doesn't feel really creative, but really rooted in things. But Ruth Wilson Gomar talks about this a lot, is that abolition requires a lot of imagination, and we haven't seen that yet, right? What we can say is that we need to scale back the system in order to create the conditions to even create that. Like, we're not in that place yet, right? I think there's also a lot of political theory here about like how to dismantle systems to create new ones and like what that would actually look like. And a lot of that is just theory. But also I will say, right, there have been complete overhauls of societies before in the history of time. So I'm not saying it's impossible. What I'm saying is that we haven't seen what that will look like. I will also say that like we are always I'm sorry, I have to say this. We cannot imagine an idea where like the United States does not exist as it exists now, right? But I do think that we have to bring that into the conversation. Like, why is like Washington under the state? Like, like there are different communities that have different needs, different geographies, different resources, etc. And like that when I bring it back to communities, I have to talk about that because the makeup of those communities should be individual, and we should be like listening to from the ground up, right? So it's hard to like say from the top down how to say like how the entire nation will like function under this way because we can't imagine it, but we can start with like scaling back these systems, pulling back, making the system not as strong as it is now, taking the abolitionist steps to abolish the police. I don't have a concrete answer for you, right? And that's why I have the whole syllabus, because I think a lot of people smarter than me that have thought about this a lot more. But I do think a lot of this is about like how do movements actually function to like destabilize and take down systems, which it was just a long game, right? We talked about a lot in abolition that we're at the beginning of it, right? Like we're doing the marathon, not the sprint. Like might not see this change. We might not, we can't imagine it. We're just doing the first step, right?
Right, very much the same. So I'm not going to say I don't want a utopian society because I do want to plant seeds of trees I'll never sit under, right? But we don't have a utopian society now. We've never had a utopian society. So to say unless we build a utopian society, then the things we want to do to build a society that is better are falling short, right? And so I do think that we can create systems where the responders are meeting the mental health needs rather than creating the opportunity for violence, and that will be a better world, right? We can create a world where people have opportunity for housing and food so that they don't think that they need that petty crimes or other things are the ways that they're going to do that. That will be a better world. Right. And do I have the solution for a utopian world? No, but I can see the ills and imagine solutions and work with people towards solutions that address those things on a path towards the utopian society that I want that. Right. So I'm not going to say, oh, that's imagine. Yeah, but a better world is better.
Thank you also.
Also, just so many people in prison who I think most people can agree shouldn't be in prison. I think that's like a good place also to start. Like most people who are sitting in prison are not convicted of violent crimes. So many people in prison have actually not been convicted of crimes. Like we're sitting in cages right now, right? So that's just like also a thing that I'm like, we have to start somewhere. We have to like start moving towards a thing. I don't have the complete picture answer book written on like what it'll look like. I also like think fiction actually serves a lot of purpose here. Like there's actually a lot of abolitionists that do speculative fiction to actually kind of like rehearse and like exercise that imagination. I can't remember who wrote. Iman Abdulhadi just wrote a speculative fiction based in abolition. I recommend that. Actually, I need to read it too, but everyone's talking about it, so maybe I'll put that on the syllabus. But I think there's actually exercises we can do in actually rehearsing and like exercising that. Like I don't.
Yeah, I mean, even Star Trek is a mostly post-crime, post-scarcity community, and so they dare to imagine that. Yeah, let's move on to the last question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Got it right.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'll try to keep this short. I also live in DC, and so there's kind of like two examples going on right now. It's right next door to Baltimore. So in DC, we have like a surge of troops in the military. People don't want to be where they are, like restaurants are suffering. People don't want to go on the metro and so forth. But it looks tough and it looks effective because they are everywhere. So obviously they can catch crime everywhere. That's just the optics of it. Whereas in Baltimore, the mayor has had a tremendous success in reducing crime, and he's doing the kinds of things like investing in youth programs, like sending personal letters to at-risk youth and other things like that. It's being very effective, but it doesn't look effective because the lines aren't clear. And it looks wasteful, it looks soft, and that's like less popular. So how do you deal with explaining to people that it's like actually cheaper and more effective to do these things that don't feel right? And then how do you also talk to people who are like, I feel like unsafe and victimized, like do something hard and tough and like scary for like the bad people?
I think one thing that I often talk about is that most of what we're talking about right now is like, I think other people would call like broken windows policing or like poverty, policing, just like people doing everyday shit, right? Like cops are the kind of things we're talking about, like cops are not really good at like going after your landlord for like exploiting you or like, again, like the abuse situations we talked about, domestic violence, things like that. And so that kind of stuff looks good, right? Because it creates this like enhanced idea of what we think public safety looks like, right? Like, but also for the everyday person, like those empty streets in DC doesn't spell good, great society, because where is everybody? They're living in fear, right? Of like what's on the streets. And it's funny you bring up the tree example, because I do that tree example with you all the time. I like do the butcher paper and I'm like, here's the fruits, and like you have to go down the line to go to the root cause, and like everyone has to do it on markers. And actually what I found is that like most people actually like have a general idea of that, because most of us are actually way closer to being evicted or being on the streets or losing our jobs or not having access to healthcare than we really like to think that we are, but we actually are, right? Or most of us have someone in our lives that actually have experienced this, where they're on the streets, or they've done something illegal. Like and someone on another panel brought up, most of us have done things that are illegal, like smoked weed, sped, like like there are things every day that everyone's negotiating. How much can I go against that line? Again, in Texas, everything is illegal, right? Like, so I just want to say that, like, I think actually getting people to the root of like what it looks like versus what it actually is, actually like people get it pretty clearly. It's just the image of that, you're exactly right, is like easy to politicize, right? It's easy to, and I think for me, and again, I think this seems wishy-washy, but the storytelling is important, right? Like youth actually saying like what, changed for them is not ever going to be the military or the cops. It's like what you're talking about. It's like the program that got them out of the situation that they were in, the right person, the teacher, the social worker, like that's actually like who is like intervening in those situations. So it's not as clear cut of an answer, but I do think we need to like work on the message. I think so much of this conversation is about messaging and like narrative, because it's politics also.
Thank you, guys.
All right, yeah, so, hey. Hey, yeah, that's my line.